Do you know who is the world's largest oil exporter? If not, come with us on this journey. In 2022, Saudi Arabia's oil exports had a great value of $224.8 million, 16.7% of global oil exports. The main destinations of Saudi Arabia's oil exports are China, accounting for 21.7% of Saudi's crude exports, Japan at 16.2%, and South Korea at 13.1%, ASEAN at 11.8%, India at 11%. Considering these vast figures, what would happen if Saudi Arabia ceases its oil exports worldwide? Do you know Saudi Arabia was a desert where nomads lived before oil discovery? However, after the discovery of oil in 1985, things changed. But suppose that in 2024, if oil exports in Saudi Arabia ceased due to any consequences, Saudi's economy would collapse because Saudi makes 40% of its GDP from its oil. Let's discuss what would happen if Saudi Arabs stopped oil exports to OPEC. Let's first understand what OPEC is. OPEC is an organization of oil-producing countries having 12 members. Among these 12 members, Saudi Arabia is the most significant contributor to OPEC, controlling 1/3 of the total OPEC reserves. In 2022, its oil export revenues totaled $888 billion. So OPEC will only ultimately influence the world oil market without Saudi Arabia, and prices will drastically increase. If Saudi Arabia ceases its oil exports, then the oil supply will decrease to a considerable extent, which will cause oil prices to shoot up. As a result, there would be a high inflation rate globally. For instance, during COVID, there was less demand for oil worldwide, so OPEC had to lower the oil supply. As a result, it considerably impacted the world's largest economies, such as China and the USA. Effect on China if Saudi Arabia ceases its oil export. China is the largest importer of oil from Saudi Arabia. In the 1990s, China was self-sufficient in its oil needs, but now depends on imports for about 72%. The reason that the world's second largest economy, China, has become addicted to foreign oil is that it has become a world leader in the production of petrochemicals, which are petroleum and natural gas. China needs around 13 million barrels daily to function, so it directly relies on importing crude, gas, and refined petroleum. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 11.28 million barrels a day to China. Hence, ceasing the oil exportation to China means starving millions of Chinese to death. CPEC includes several energy infrastructure projects, including constructing power plants and pipelines. If Saudi Arabia ceases oil exports, it could affect the viability of some of these projects, especially those related to oil and gas transportation and refining. However, to avoid such consequences, China has to make a deal with Saudi Arabia to strengthen energy ties. Aramco agreed to buy a 10% stake in Rongsheng for 24.6 billion yuan. As a part of the deal, it would supply 48,000 barrels of oil daily. Effect on the USA. The USA itself is the largest oil producer in the world. Still, it imports more oil than it exports. The USA is one of the most industrialized countries in the world, producing 16.6% of global manufacturing output. So, to meet its needs, the USA has to import a large amount of oil. But interestingly, the USA only imports a little oil from Saudi Arabia. The import of oil from Saudi Arabia considerably decreased in the 2000s. The average oil imports from Saudi Arabia was 558,000 barrels per day. Still, at the same time, the imports from Canada increased to 3.8 billion barrels per day. However, the economy of the USA is incredibly diversified and is not very dependent on oil. Still, if Saudi ceases its oil exports, there may be a price hike for oil in the US. Still, Saudi will face severe consequences because the US will lift the sanctions on Venezuela and Iran for oil production. Saudi will have to face a substantial economic loss. However, to circumvent these consequences, both countries agreed upon a deal that the United States would offer military protection for Saudi Arabia's oil fields, and in return, the Saudis would price their oil sales exclusively in United States dollars. Effect on the South Asian countries' oil prices always greatly influenced the economy and inflation rate in South Asian countries. For instance, the most essential oil price change was observed in 1973 when OPEC reduced oil exports due to the Arab-Israel. It hiked oil prices from $4 per barrel in 1973 to $9 per barrel in 1974. Also, there was a massive oil price change when Iran stopped oil production in 1979 due to the Iran-Iraq War. Most South Asian countries import oil, from Saudi Arabia to a considerable extent. For example, Pakistan imports $1.88 billion of oil from Saudi Arabia. The largest South Asian economy, India, imports $17.8 billion of oil from Saudi. So, suppose Saudi Arabia ceases its oil exports. In that case, there will be a massive price hike in oil in South Asian countries, and the inflation rate will also increase by 4.7%. There are approximately 1.5 million workers residing in Saudi Arabia who migrated from South Asian countries. If the oil ceases, there will be a direct impact on these workers, and countries in South Asia like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, which largely depend on foreign remittances, will face a massive economic crisis. Effect on the mega projects of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has started working on many projects, with oil funding to diversify its economy. The most important ones include the NEOM, the Line, and Oxagon. These projects involve the concept of diversifying Saudi Arabia's economy. They were launched in the 2000s and are expected to be completed in approximately 2030, so they are included in Saudi's Vision 2030, according to which Saudi Arabia will be no longer dependent on its oil sector. But what if Saudi ceases its oil exports? Before the completion of these projects, there will be no funds to complete these ongoing projects. There would be a huge pressure on non-oil sectors to make up the country's needs and also fund these projects side by side. Since the non-oil sector of Saudi isn't strong enough to do so, they will have to take huge amounts of loans to settle the projects in return. They could end up being a country like many African developing countries with tons of loans and sanctions on them. And of course, it would be a nightmare for any first world country to fall back in the state of a third world country. Conclusion. However, it is almost impossible for Saudi Arabia to cease its oil exports because it relies on oil revenue. However, Saudi may run out of oil in the next 30 to 50 years. So Saudi Arabia is getting ready for the post-oil era. The government is investing heavily in renewable energy, specifically solar power, since Saudi Arabia receives so much sunlight all year round, which will be sufficient to meet local energy demand. Thanks for watching our video. Remember to like and subscribe.